Nicky Bosa, Eric Armstead, DeForest Buckner, D Ford, Solomon Thomas. They have a dominant defensive group. I think they were the only defensive line in football this year that had 4 rushers that had 6.5 sacks or more. So that is the strength of this 49ers team, and that's the part that Matt LaFleur has to be concerned with in looking at their first matchup. But the one thing that gave me a little bit of optimism for Green Bay going into this game is how they used Aaron Rodgers against the Seattle Seahawks. They got him out on the perimeter. They used a lot of swap boots to provide a target for him immediately in the flat off of the play fake. I think getting the ball out of Aaron Rodgers' hand has to be a priority in this game, just because you can't afford to give those 49ers pass rushers an opportunity to get to him. So I think if Matt LaFleur and that offensive staff put together a similar game plan in terms of getting the ball out of their quarterback's hands, they'll have a chance to be successful.
I understand what Kyle Shanahan's saying. I totally disagree with him because of exactly what Canty alluded to. There are certain games where you just throw out what happened in the past. You just throw it out and you say, that's not going to duplicate itself.
But we just saw Tennessee. We were talking about the Tennessee and the
Absolutely.
Chiefs.
And there's where it's like, okay, there's a defensive score, there's a blocked field goal, there's a muffed handling on a field goal, there's a lot of weird things that happened. There are certain games where, especially if it's about pass rush versus offensive line, you big people versus big people, and you say, well, what is going to change? And I've kind of backed myself into a corner a bit on this because you guys know very well my commitment to take integrity and pick integrity, which is I picked the Packers to go to the Super Bowl before the year, and they're one of 4 teams remaining, so I'll be damned if I'm abandoning it. With that said, the day after that football game, 37-8 San Francisco, we sat right here, and I said, I think the Packers can still make the Super Bowl, but they're going to need someone to beat San Francisco for them, because it seemed like the San Francisco front 4, and that was a game without D Ford. You mentioned Balaga didn't play, but neither did D Ford for San Francisco. That front 4 seemed so overwhelming compared to the Packers' offensive line that Green Bay couldn't get into anything they wanted to do. They were 1 of 15 on. It was the worst game they played all year. Fewest yards, fewest points. Worst they were on third downs all year. 1 for 15 on third downs. It was a terrible game. So I don't think San Francisco is going to be that dominant as they were in the game 2 months ago, because I don't think this game is going to be a blowout. But Green Bay better have been in the lab since then, figuring out, are we going to have to do something to reference Seattle? That Seattle does a lot. Bring in a 6th offensive lineman. Are we going to have to do a lot of misdirection, screens, something to get that pass rush off balance, off schedule? Because if that pass rush and front 4 has anything close to the effectiveness we saw in the regular season, Green Bay's drawing dead. I don't care how many times Jimmy Garoppolo throws it to the other team, he's going to throw it to Green Bay, and Green Bay's then going to go 3 and out. Because if you can't block these guys, and you mentioned how dominant the D-line's been statistically, and they're supposed to be. Yep. Nobody's put more resources into a defensive front than John Lynch in San Francisco since they've been there. This is how they've built that team. That will determine whether or not Green Bay can stay in this game. Can you give Aaron Rodgers more than 2 seconds to scan the field and figure out who the ball is going to?
And can you provide some easy completions for Aaron Rodgers as well? That was one of the things that I thought Matt LaFleur did well in that game against the Seahawks. I mean, in that gotta-have-it situation right before the 2-minute warning, that throw to Jimmy Graham, if you look at the formation that they built, it was 3 by 1, and they had the number 3 receiver clear out because they had press man coverage, and then they brought Jimmy Graham on a crosser, and it created a natural pick with the safety who was in coverage on him, and that's an easy pitch and catch. It was actually the play that they used on the first down in the game, third down of the game on their first possession. So you look at those types of things. If Matt LaFleur can throw in enough of that, some high percentage throws for Aaron Rodgers, get the ball out of his hands, move the pocket, move the launch point a little bit, I think they'll have a chance. Because let's face it, the quarterback on the other side of this matchup hasn't been a world beater this year in Jimmy Garoppolo. And if the Minnesota Vikings could do anything with the interception that Aaron Kendricks got right before halftime, you're probably talking about a different game in the second half, a game that's a little more competitive out there in the Bay Area this past weekend. So I think it's all about Green Bay being able to try to do enough in terms of making some easy throws for Aaron Rodgers, but then also when you get in those situations, relying on Aaron Rodgers' greatness to take you over the top, because clearly they have an advantage with the quarterback matchup.
But can he quickly also maybe a little psychological coaching by Kyle Shanahan to make sure his guys forget what happened? This is not going to be an easy game.
That's 100% what he's doing.
Right?
He wants to make sure that the guys have the requisite urgency and intensity that they have to have going into an NFC championship game.
Exactly. All right, let's take a break. Coming up, did Joe Burrow prove he's a can't-miss NFL star? We discuss next on First.
On the way home last night, I think about guys like Drew Brees. I think about guys like Tom Brady, Peyton Manning's of the world. And, where I am in my career right now, I'm just finishing year 8, and where those guys were, it's I want to be the best in the world. That's just the reality. And so I know this offseason, and for me, it's what are the next 5 years going to look like? What's it going to look like for this organization? And what are we going to do to make sure that happens? Because those guys in the years 8 through 13 or so, that's where they really cemented themselves and their legacy. And I think that's what I think about, just to be honest with you. I think about that. I think about trying to be the best in the world.
Nick, you've been on this all this season, even most of last season as well, that this Seattle offense isn't really built around what Russell does best.
Yep.
So I ask, are the Seahawks wasting their window with Russell Wilson, if you will?
I can't say they're wasting their window with him because, first of all, I think they're only probably halfway through it. He's finished his 8th season. I bet he plays 15, 16 years at a high level in today's NFL, and the guy who's never been hurt, never missed a game. You have no reason to think he's not going to play a very long time. And, by the way, he just became the first quarterback ever to have a winning record each of his first 8 years. First guy to ever do that, and you've got to give him immense credit for that, and the organization immense credit for putting pieces around him, for never falling off, or even when they are rebuilding, staying competitive, winning at least 9 games. So I do want to give Seattle and Pete Carroll and John Schneider credit, and I think Schneider's one of the best GMs in football. My issue with Seattle, and what you're alluding to, is would they call their offensive game plan any different if Blake Bortles were their quarterback? And I can't see it. They call games like throwing the football is a last resort, like their quarterback is a liability. They call games, to use a more contemporary example than Blake, because he's a backup now, the way you would expect the Titans to. We have a superstar running back and a quarterback, even if his numbers are good, we don't really trust in Ryan Tannehill. But that's the opposite of what they have. They have a superstar quarterback and Travis Homer and Marshawn Lynch is their running back as of late. And so last year, they lose a playoff game, in my opinion, because they did not trust Russell enough. Instead, they just kept running their head into a brick wall against the Cowboys' rush defense. In this postseason, they handed the ball off to Lynch and Homer 32 times for 58 yards. That's, what's less than, what, 1.8 yards per carry?
Not good.
It's horrible. Their best rusher was their best passer, was Russell Wilson. And so I don't want to be too harsh because I think they have a great organization. I think Carroll, holistically, for everything he does, is a really good coach. But they need to modernize their offense around the fact that they have one of the 3 best quarterbacks in the world for them right now in the apex prime of his career. And to me, they didn't throughout the regular season. They got away with Russell Wilson pulling him out of the fire in close games. And they certainly didn't in that playoff loss to Green Bay, where once again they were like, well, if it's close late, Russell will save us. But then forget the player's name. He dropped the pass on 1st and 10, and then Russell, their like 3rd string wide receiver, dropped the pass on 1st and 10.
Yeah.
And then they end up having
Malik Turner.
Yeah. Thank you, Canty. He has that drop, and Russell gets sacked, and all of a sudden, when you're trying to win by those margins, one drop pass, one bad sack, and you lose a football game that maybe you shouldn't have lost. So I do think they need to adjust that considerably, but rinse, repeat. We could be playing the same segment from a year ago after the Cowboys game when I was saying the exact same thing.
Well, here's the thing. I don't want to be overly critical of the Seattle Seahawks just because they've had a lot of success. I mean, almost unprecedented when you think about it. What, they've made the playoffs 7 out of Russell Wilson's first 8 seasons.
And the one year
you got 2 Super Bowl appearances. You got 1 championship. So it's hard for me to say that they're wasting him. I think Pete Carroll, in a roundabout way, is trying to protect his quarterback, because when you're paying your quarterback $35